Rain hit the bakery window as a fist of hands closed over Clara Hayes' upper arm and pulled. Fear climbed into her ribs so fast she couldn't pull a breath. A man shoved her toward a car and shouted an order she couldn't hear over the rain. Move.
This entry here, the third
One voice barked. Someone yanked her bag, and the strap cut into her shoulder. In the span of 3 seconds, her world narrowed to cold metal, wet hair, and the hiss of tires on wet pavement. Fear was the engine beneath every movement. She scrambled, she pushed, she tested a phone she couldn't find. That raw fear pushed Clara's hands to work under a sleeve, looking for a screen she could use to call for help. By the time she realized the men had the wrong woman, they were already closing the rear door of an armored sedan. Clara tasted copper and yeast from the bakery on her lips. She had left work late, carrying a box of leftover rolls. Her shift at the bakery had ended at midnight. She had meant only to walk 2 blocks home. Now, the street was a tunnel of rain and black coats and a tall man with a dark face at the window whose jaw was a straight line. Clara's fear shifted into a sharp, practical question. Who had they meant to take? Clara's hands moved before her brain could decide. She dug at the seam of her messenger bag with wet fingers, thumb worrying the small silver locket she always kept against the strap. Her mind ran through known facts, her address, a single emergency contact, a supervisor's number, but she could not reach any of it. She swallowed. What do you want? She asked, voice small but steady enough that one of the men glanced back. Tell me her name, a voice ordered. The man at the window did not speak. He watched. The rain stitched itself against the glass and made distance harder to read. Clara answered by giving the right name for herself and the wrong information for the situation. She told them she was only Clara Hayes, a baker going home. Her answer landed into silence and then into the low, quick negotiation of men who needed facts. In the back of the car, 2 men argued about plans. Marco, a lieutenant, counted names on a crumpled paper. The armored interior smelled of leather and oil. Clara's wrists were bound with thick tape, but she could still turn her head. The tall man, Luca Romano, stood at the front seat and stared back at her. Luca's face held a distance she couldn't pass. He did not shout. He did not touch her. He watched. Clara catalogued what she could see. The thin scar along Luca's jaw where a darker line interrupted his skin, the 5 o'clock shadow, the gold signet glinting as he folded his hands. She noticed the way his fingers moved toward the ring when his jaw tightened. She watched him the way one watches a train coming in the dark, measured, private, full of possible damage. That watching made Clara's fear split into another feeling. Suspicion. She suspected a mistake, and she suspected she was no longer safe the moment they learned the error. The car stopped at an unmarked building. Men moved like muscle memory. Someone muttered a name into a radio and the engine cut. The rain on the roof of the car slowed to a staccato. Marco shoved Clara out first. Snowing candlelight from somewhere inside spilled onto the stairwell, incongruent with the armored sedan's cold practicality. Clara felt a sudden, sharp tilt between 2 worlds. The urban violence she had just left and a domestic, controlled interior she did not expect to find inside a safe house. Sophia opened the door before they reached the living room. She offered a blanket with hands that shook a little. The blanket smelled faintly of soap and lemon. Sophia's voice was careful. Sit, Sophia. She pressed the blanket into Clara's lap and, without waiting for permission, slid a paper cup with warm tea toward her. The small, clean motion grounded something. Clara wrapped her fingers around the cup and found it steadied the tremor in her hands. Her fear gave way, in that moment, to a kind of guarded relief. She kept her eyes on Luca. They set her down at a low table under the candlelight. Luca did not sit across from her immediately. Marco spoke first. She isn't the one on the list. Marco. He tapped the paper again. We picked the wrong woman. His voice had an edge that suggested consequences. Marco's hands were quick and exact. He moved like someone used to making small corrections under pressure. Clara looked at Marco, then at Luca, and forced her voice to steady. "I don't know why you're here," she said. "I have a job. I have a home." I didn't see anything. She named what mattered in simple inventory. Job, home, nothing to hide. Her sentences were short because thinking long left room for panic. Luca finally moved. He came to the table and folded his long hands together. He did not ask where she lived. He did not ask who she worked for. He instead, quietly, for her hands. The request felt like an instruction. Clara hesitated and then extended a hand. The skin of her knuckles quickened when his palm closed over her wrist. He inspected her locket as if it were a document. Marco found a scrap of paper during a quick search and held it so Luca could see. On the scrap were 2 words and a number. Luca's face did something small, a tightening around the eyes that Clara could only read as absence. She remembered the photograph in her locket. A woman with a braid and a smile that did not reach her eyes. Clara kept the locket shut with a thumb. Her fingers had the reflex of protection. Sofia, who had been watching the exchange, broke a silence. "Would you get us a plate?" she asked Clara, voice soft. The request made no sense in the moment's logic, but it pulled on Clara's practical side. She rose and moved to the small kitchen alcove to fetch a dish. The motion felt like a simple task, and it shifted the room's center of attention for one breath. Clara's hands worked with the plate. She noticed how her fingers trembled against ceramic. She spilled a drop of tea onto the counter and cursed under her breath. Luca watched her from the doorway, expression unreadable. He stepped closer to the sink and, without touching her, reached for a towel and handed it over. The gesture was small and precise. Clara's suspicion shifted in a slow tilt into something sharper, curiosity. Her insides loosened enough to let her register the way his voice sounded when he gave an order to Marco. Low, controlled, with a gravel undercurrent. While they argued quietly about whether the wrong woman required a quick release or a longer hold, Clara direct questions, "Will you take me home?" "Clara, I can walk out the front door. I won't tell anyone anything I shouldn't tell." Her voice was plain. Marco slammed a palm on the table and leaned in. "You don't understand, Marco, we can risk it." "Not tonight." His words pushed a new current under Clara's fear. This was not merely a mistake to be apologized for. There was a visible calculation of danger in Marco's eyes. He named an unseen threat with a clipped phrase. "They watched the target last week. If she got out, they'd know our heads." The line made the real risk concrete. Clara's mind filled with images she tried not to hold. Men outside with radios, the bakery shutter, her plain apartment windows. Clara found her voice again. "What do you mean they watched?" she asked. "Who watched who?" Her questions were short. Luca watched her ask them and did not answer. Instead, he set a cup down on the table and tapped it twice with a ringed finger. The taps were deliberate, an unspoken statement of boundaries. The group set rules. Clara had to turn over her phone. She would stay in the apartment. No one would talk to her until the situation was clearer. The list of small restrictions read like the terms of a temporary sentence. Clara accepted them with quiet movement. Obeying felt safer than bargaining. Her fear folded into a cautious compliance that let her scan the apartment for exits. Later, when she asked for paper and a pen, Sofia came with them quickly. "I don't want to be here." Clara, as she wrote her sister's number down and slid it towards Sofia, "Tell Anna I am okay. Tell her the bakery closed early. Tell her I am safe." She folded the paper twice. The action made her feel less helpless. Sofia read the number and nodded, voice low. "I will try Anna. Luca will decide." The moment made Clara feel like a child passing a note through a teacher's hands. She had surrendered agency and was seeking an adult's promise. Marco returned from a quick check at the door and announced surveillance outside. 2 cars circled once and left. But they were watching the front block. Marco. He kept his words short, like a list of facts. Luca stood and moved toward the door, fingers tensing against the knob even though he did not open it. His stance said protection without flourish. The watch outside sharpened the night stakes. Clara's fear moved into anger now, a hot, quiet edge. She stood and faced Luca. "You could have let me go when you found out you were wrong," she said. "Someone snatched me." "You could have let me out." Her voice did not break, but it carried the friction of fury. Luca's eyes did not change. He placed his hands on the table. "We didn't know if you had anything to do with them," he said. "We couldn't risk a leak." The exchange was short and direct. Each line revealed something and covered something up. That night, a small reveal shifted everything. While checking Clara's pockets, Marco pulled from her messenger bag a torn receipt folded into a tight square. He handed it to Luca. Clara tried to explain how it came to be. She had bought rolls and kept the receipt by habit. The receipt had a name printed faintly in the corner that matched a name Luca's face remembered with an expression Clara could not interpret. She felt her throat close. Clara's curiosity overrode fear for a moment. "What name?" she asked. Marco it out loud, and the sound landed like a concrete drop. Luca's shoulders tightened. He half turned and ran a hand across his face in a motion that suggested an old pain. Clara saw the gesture and understood one thing. The scrap connected to a loss in Luca's life that was not hers, but that now involved her because of coincidence. Her chest hurt. Sofia watched Luca with a small, careful smile that did not reach her eyes. She moved closer to Clara and asked for a small favor. Could Clara show the photograph in the locket? Clara hesitated only because the photograph reopened a personal door. She handed the locket into Sofia's steady palms. Sofia lifted the tiny photo and said the name out loud softly. The room tightened again. Luca's fingers brushed his ring. At that instant, an external sound interrupted the moment. Footsteps on the stairwell and the scrape of a car door outside the building. Marco snapped to the window and peered out. Someone's back. Marco. The beat was a shift of tempo. The room went from slow to taut. Men moved into positions with efficient silence. Sofia moved Clara to stand behind the low couch. Luca stepped in front of Clara. The protective shape he made with his body was a thing Clara felt physically, like a wall she had not asked for. The silence broke into urgent movement when a hard rap hit the apartment door, repeated and heavy. Marco's hand went to a concealed drawer, and the sound of steel being readied threaded through the apartment. Someone called through the door, a name that did not belong to any of the people inside. The voice outside demanded entrance. The room's air changed. Clara felt her pulse thump in her throat. Luca's voice was calm and flat. "Stay back," he said. Marco counted steps on the stair and whispered orders. The intruders hammered again, and a shout followed. The lock held for a breath. Then the handle shook violently. A man's voice screamed something, and the deadbolt rattled. Luca moved with sudden speed. He shoved the couch to create an obstacle, threw himself toward the hallway, and the first gunshot cracked the air. It did not belong to anyone inside at first. The sharp sound made Clara's ears ring. Clara's body reacted with automatic choices. She ducked behind the couch, hands over her head, feeling the sting of sparks from a heater below the low window. She smelled gunpowder and wet wool. Her breath came in short bursts. She tried to keep her eyes on Luca's shoulders. He shouted orders, "Marco, Sofia." The words were short and direct. Then a second crash, and Luca's shoulder collided with the door as it gave a sliver. A fist shoved inside, and Luca's hand closed on it. The struggle at the doorway became a tangle of limbs and a flurry of punches. The intruders tried to force the latch, and Luca shoved back with a force Clara could see in the twitch of his neck. Shots rang closer. Someone outside called Luca's name with hate in the syllables. The sound made Clara's stomach fold into a squeezed line. She could not see everything from behind the couch, but she saw Luca's profile thrown into candlelight, his jaw set, his hand clamped on the door. He took the blows meant for the room. The physical detail made the protection unmistakable. He placed himself between the attackers and her. The fight was short, violent, and precise. Marco hit a man with the butt of a weapon, and the intruders finally retreated, retreating with curses and the weight of surprise. The door held. Sofia pressed a towel into the small cut on Clara's wrist, where a shard of glass had nicked her skin. The blood was bright and immediate. Luca checked Clara's hands with 2 quick, practiced motions and then took his watch off to wrap a cloth around a deeper cut by his thumb. He did it without saying why. The motion felt intimate and businesslike at once. After the attackers left, the apartment smelled of burnt candle wax and spilled tea. Clara's chest stayed raw. Adrenaline settled in waves. Around the table the group recalibrated with blunt sentences. Marco cleaned a pistol methodically and put it back in place. Sofia set a new blanket over Clara's knees. The physical acts, wiping, bandaging, counting, spoke more than any explanation. Clara noticed the way Luca's hands moved, efficient, careful, and oddly tender when he tied the last knot on the bandage. She kept her mouth closed, letting a new feeling settle in. Something like stunned gratitude mixed with continued suspicion. They spoke then, quietly, about what must happen next. Luca decided that she would stay until dawn. He it as a fact. There was no argument after his words. Marco agreed, and Sofia sat down opposite Clara and folded her own hands on the table. The list of reasons Luca gave was spare and precise. Surveillance, unknown risk, a link to a name on a scrap she had carried. Clara could not force herself to call this fair, but she could do the practical things that made the waiting less unbearable. She handed Sofia a napkin and closed the locket carefully beneath it. Before she slept on the couch, Clara Luca one last time softly, "If you find out I had nothing to do with this, will you let me go?" Her voice shook on the last word. Luca looked at her for a long second. He touched his signet ring with one finger and studied the band as if tracing a map. He did not answer with promises. He instead, "I will keep you safe tonight." The sentence was not a pledge of freedom. It was a pledge of protection. It settled in the room like a fact. Clara folded her hands and closed her eyes with the weight of that promise between them. Outside, rain slowed to a thin mist under the street lamps. Inside the safe apartment, a single candle burned down beside 2 cups on the low table. The wax pooled and the wick bent. A drop of melted candle fell and smoked on the saucer. Clara felt exhaustion and a tightness in her jaw. The night had delivered danger and an odd, concrete kindness. A bandage, a towel, a hand placed once over hers. The chapter closed in a small, visible way, a slammed bolt, a wrapped wrist, a quiet arrangement of blankets. The immediate threat was pushed back, not resolved. Dawn would bring more decisions and a deeper reckoning, but for now the apartment held them together by simple acts. Tending to cuts, counting facts, and keeping the door locked. Clara lay on the couch and listened to the soft shuffle of Luca's shoes in the kitchen. She opened her eyes when Sofia set the blanket over her with steady hands. "Sleep if you can, Sofia." Marco moved to a window and watched the street. Luca stood by the door, though not as a jailer. He stood as a man who had just chosen a small, expensive risk. Clara curled one hand around the cool chain of the locket under the blanket. She pressed the metal to her palm and felt the ridged edge. The night's concrete events, being grabbed on the sidewalk, a wrong name on a receipt, a knife of glass on her wrist, and a man who took the blows meant for the room, sat like pieces of evidence in her mouth. She closed her eyes and let the exhaustion take her. The last sound she heard was Luca's soft step, then a quiet chair scraping the floor as someone else took watch. The chapter ends with the door locked and Luca answering the knock that would come later with a steady hand. The night's immediate storm contained for now, and a harder reckoning waiting with dawn. Rain hit the car window, and a gloved hand forced Clara's shoulder down as the driver slammed the brakes. Fear lodged under Clara's ribs in a way that made her fingers go numb. She swallowed and kept her mouth closed. A tall man leaned forward, his face ablaze in the amber streetlight, and said, "Stop the car." "Hold here." His voice left no question. Clara's fear hardened into suspicion when she realized his eyes were looking at her like he expected to find something dangerous. She pushed at the seat with one palm and could not move the door. The bag at her feet had been yanked earlier. Her receipts and the silver locket had been pressed against her ribs when hands dragged her from the bakery. The rain that had hit the pastry shop window minutes before, when someone had grabbed her arm and shoved her toward the street, was still wet on her hair. Clara kept naming things in her head: bakery counter, flour on her apron, the sudden tug on her sleeve. Naming kept panic from widening into a panic she could not control. The man who had ordered the stop leaned back and watched her hands. She saw the slope of his cheekbone, the shadow of a scar along his jaw, and the slow way he folded his fingers against a gold ring. He did not smile. "What's your name?" he asked, and the driver, a broad man in a dark coat, glanced in his mirror. "Clara Hayes," she said. Her voice sounded small in the car. The driver barked an instruction, and two other figures appeared at the vehicle's windows before she could take another breath. One of them yanked the door open and hauled her out, boots splashing in the shallow puddles beside the curb. They moved fast. Clara's scarf slid free, and she felt the cold on the back of her neck. Marco, he introduced himself with a clipped nod and no softness, led her toward a building with a locked iron gate. Elena, a woman in a slim coat and precise hair, checked her pockets and fingertips as if she expected something to be lodged in the seams. The two men scanned the street and the alley, then closed the gate behind them with a soft metal click. Inside, the safe apartment smelled faintly of candle wax and old books. Candles stood in clusters on low tables. Their flames made warm, shallow circles on the floorboards. Luca Romano sat near a low table in the sitting room, his suit unbuttoned just enough to look human when the light hit him. He watched Clara as if deciding whether she belonged in a photograph or in a cell. Clara kept her hands in front of her. She showed the men the small silver locket as if it were a passport. Her movements were deliberate because she had learned to steady herself by moving. Elena took the locket and did not open it. She turned it over and traced the tiny hinge with a fingertip. "Tell me why you were on Danton Street tonight, Luca." His voice did not rise, but his question cut through the candle, muted room. Marco's hand rested near his belt. Elena's eyes did not leave Clara's face. "I was closing the bakery," Clara answered. "I live above the shop." She stopped because a notebook fell from the low table where Luca had been holding a cigarette earlier, and one of his men bent to pick it up with a quiet curse. The sound was small, but it shifted the room's balance. Luca's jaw tightened. "Elena, names of anyone you saw, any customers?" Her voice had the measured edge of interrogation practice. "Only two regulars left late. Clara, Mir. Jansen, he pays cash, and a woman who ordered the lemon tart tonight." "I don't know her name." Clara put her hand under her chin and felt the faint scrape where someone had snatched her messenger bag. "The rain started heavy when they grabbed me. I didn't see faces clearly." Luca picked up a folded receipt from the table and unfolded it with slow, exact movements. He held it so the candlelight made the paper a pale rectangle. Elena leaned in and read the address out loud: 12 Bingham. 2 private rooms rented last week, payment in cash. Clara's throat closed. She remembered the receipt. It had slipped from her bag when someone had yanked the strap in the street. She had dropped coins earlier to steady a tray at the counter, she thought, but she could not remember putting that slip inside the bag. The idea that the paper had ended up there without her knowing felt like a new, foreign weight. "I didn't put that there." Clara quickly. Her voice rose. She pulled the scarf tighter and touched the locket at her throat as if it could prove the truth. "I swear I don't know why it's in my bag." Elena's eyes narrowed. "People talk, Clara. A receipt ties you to a place where men meet without names." She set the paper down and folded her hands. Clara's fear shifted toward indignation. She straightened her shoulders despite the tremor in them. "I work early in the morning," she said. "I am not part of anything." She looked at Luca. "I don't even know the address on that receipt." Luca's gaze did not move from her face. Do you know anyone who do this to you?" His question was careful. Marco's fingers tapped a rhythm on the arm of his chair. "No, Clara." She felt the word leave her thin and honest. "I don't have enemies. The bakery is my life. I pay rent. I look after my mother when I can. Please." Her voice broke on the last word. Marco stood and moved to the hallway. He checked the door latch and the kitchen window as if following a routine he had practiced many times. When he returned, he said, "We will sweep the building. If someone planted something, we'll find it." The sweep took less than 10 minutes. The men moved like a single machine through the apartment, opening cabinets with gloved hands and tapping behind picture frames. Elena stayed near the table and watched Clara as if she could read the woman's face for secrets. During the sweep, Luca about the locket again. Clara opened it for him at Elena's request. Inside was a small photograph. Clara and a woman whose hair was braided, both of them laughing over a tray of pastries. Luca held the locket an inch from his face and did not speak. He returned it to Clara with fingers that did not tremble. When the sweep finished without finding weapons or planted phones, a short, brittle silence took the room. Luca moved to the window and peered into the street, where the puddles still trembled with raindrops. He straightened and walked back, stopping only a step from Clara. "You stay where we can see you tonight. Marco will sit in the kitchen. Elena, make a note of every person Clara speaks to. If she lies, tell me." His tone left no room for argument. Clara wanted to argue. Instead, she lifted the locket to her mouth for a moment, as if tasting the metal could steady her. She had a sudden, clear thought. She would not beg. She would not make promises she couldn't keep. She would answer, truthfully, and she would watch for openings. Night stretched and the candles burned low. Marco moved his chair to the sitting area and sat with his back straight, eyes flicking to doors and windows. Elena sat on the arm of a chair and wrote notes in a small black book. Luca stood near the doorway with his arms folded, a line of shadow along his jaw that made him seem older than his age. Clara watched him watch the room and felt a new, quiet tension. Suspicion had grown into a wary curiosity. A sudden crash split the apartment's hush. The sound came from the kitchen window like a thrown stone. Marco's hand flew to his holster. Elena dropped her notebook and moved with a speed that contradicted her calm face. Luca's head tilted, and then he moved, the room narrowing to the path between the table and the door. Footsteps thundered above them in the stairwell. Someone banged on the front gate. The candles flickered as a draft moved through the building. Marco shouted, "Hold positions!" and rushed to the entryway with Elena in his wake. Clara's pulse kicked hard against her throat. She rose without thinking and grabbed at her scarf. Luca's hand touched her elbow and his grip was firm but not crushing. He guided her back a step and said, "Get down, stay close." His voice was low, and in it there was no question of whether she would follow. Shouts came from the stairwell, muffled voices, men swearing. A metal battering on the outer door sounded like someone using a homemade tool. Marco's men bar opened and the apartment turned into a corridor of bodies, preparing to repel an attack. The attackers came through the front gate and tried the door. 3 men forced a window and clambered in with wet coats and frantic faces. The safe apartment filled with the short, violent smell of wet wool and adrenaline. Marco grabbed one man by the collar and slammed him against the wall. Elena moved to block a second's reach for a lamp. Luca's movement was controlled and precise. He did not shout, but he gave orders that cut through the chaos. Clara did not freeze. She moved toward the kitchen, grabbing a heavy ceramic mug from a counter and flinging it into the path of an incoming figure. The mug struck a forearm. The attacker staggered. Luca looked at her then, a flash of surprise crossing his features before he masked it. "Clara, down," he said. She dropped to the floor as another shadow passed over the candlelight. The world consisted of the scrape of shoes, the metallic clang of a fallen candlestick, and the quick grunts of men in close combat. Within 2 minutes, the attackers retreated. Whether they fled because they had expected the apartment to be empty, or because Luca's men were quicker and harder to break was unclear. They vanished back down the stairwell, leaving the building quiet and wet with outside noise. The room smelled of wet coats and the metallic tang of fear. Marco checked the locks and came back with his hands wet from rain. Elena ran her thumb along the edge of a dropped photograph and said, "They wanted something. They came for a reason." Clara sat on the floor with her back against the couch and felt the tremor from the fight pass through her legs. Her pulse slowed but did not settle. Suspicion turned into a fresh, angrier fear. She was a liability. The idea lodged in her throat like a stone, and she had to swallow it down. Luca crouched in front of her and asked, "Did you see any faces when they grabbed you?" His voice was soft now, but it still carried a command. "No, Clara, I only remember hands and rain and engines. I didn't see anyone clearly. I didn't hear names." Her breath hitched. Elena watched from the doorway and said, "The receipt is the problem. Someone tied you to Bingham. Either it was planted or you walked into a meeting. Which is it, Clara?" Her gaze was steady as a blade. Clara felt the locket warm against her fingers. She remembered the photograph inside. Her and the braided woman laughing. She had been late with an order once, and Mir. Jansen had scolded her for leaving the oven on. She had gone back to the bakery at night to turn it off. Those were small facts. They were not explanations for a receipt she could not recall putting in her bag. I done to know Bingham. If someone planted that receipt, I done know who or why. Her voice had the brittle firmness of someone trying not to cry. Luca's eyes flicked to Elena and then to Marco. He stood and walked to the window, placing his palms against the sill. Outside, a taxi passed, and the city swallowed its sound. He nothing for a long breath. Then he took out his phone and scrolled through messages. Elena stepped closer and lowered her voice. "We can hold her until we find out, or we can release her and let her disappear. Either way has a cost. Marco, check the back exits again and prepare a bolt on the stairwell. If this was bait, whoever put it together can try again." She moved with efficient purpose. Clara watched them act and felt oddly exposed and oddly protected at the same time. Luca returned and sat across from her. He reached out and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, the fabric cool at first before her body warmed it. "Drink this," he said, handing a cup of tea that Marco had poured. The tea smelled faintly of lemon. She took the cup with both hands and sipped. The warmth spread slowly through her fingers into her chest. Her fear shifted once more. From immediate panic to a wary gratitude, she had been grabbed by strangers in the rain. She had been hauled into a room with candles and men who might kill under a different order. Yet someone had offered her a blanket and a cup. The contradiction tightened around her like the scarf at her throat. Luca watched her hold the cup. "You will tell me if anything else occurs to you," he said. "We keep the locks, and you do not leave alone." "Understood." "Understood, Clara." She repeated the single word as if committing it to the air. Elena collected the receipt into a plastic sleeve and wrote an address in her book. Marco stood guard in the kitchen with his back to the door, his eyes slow and measured. Luca rose and walked to the hallway, pausing by the bedroom alcove where a pallet and blankets lay ready. When they were alone for a moment, Luca closed the bedroom door and turned the key. Clara sat on the edge of the pallet and watched him through the dim light. He moved to a low table, lifted a candle, and then set it down again, as if testing its steadiness. "If you are lying, I will know. People lie with their hands and their feet before their mouths. I will not have my people used." Clara looked down and opened the locket to the photograph again. "I am not part of your world," she said quietly. "I don't want to be." He touched his ring when he considered her words. "Neither did I." Once, Clara met his eyes. For the first time since the car, she noticed fatigue in the slope of his shoulders and a softness at the corner of his mouth when he blinked. She did not know what that softness meant. She did not know what it would cost her. But she also understood that leaving into the rain now would be a different thing than it had been an hour ago. Outside the door, Marco kept watch in the corridor. Elena's pen scratched quietly as she recorded names and times. Luca walked back and checked the lock, and then he sat across from Clara again. He placed his phone on the table and dialed a number he did not let her see. When he hung up, he said, "We keep you until morning. You keep the locket visible. If anyone comes for you, you call out loud. Marco will run. Elena will take notes. I will find out who put that receipt in your bag." His instructions were a line drawn in soft gum tape. Clear and final. Clara folded the blanket closer and held the cup until it warmed her hands. She had been pulled from the bakery in a rain of strangers and thrown into a room where men argued in sharp, efficient gestures. She had been suspected, searched, and then offered a cup of tea. She had thrown a mug at an intruder and survived a brief, brutal clash. Now she had a choice she had not wanted. Stay under watch in an apartment that smelled of wax and other people's cigarettes, or leave and trust that the world she knew had not been altered. She met Luca's eyes and said, "If I find anything, I tell you. If someone comes for me, I call out." She it in 3 simple sentences that sounded like vows because she had no other words. He nodded once and folded his hands. At the threshold, he paused and then locked the bedroom door again. He instructed Marco to sit by the stairwell until dawn. Elena gathered her notes and moved to the window to watch the street below. Luca handed Clara the blanket over her shoulders once more and, before he stepped back into the sitting room, he looked at her with the same steady assessment that had greeted her in the car. Clara pressed the locket between her fingers and listened for the city outside. The rain tapered. Somewhere in the night, a taxi door shut and its engine moved off. The apartment held the residue of the night's violence and the careful order of men who had turned a flare of danger into a contained problem. Clara closed the locket and slipped it beneath the blanket where she could touch it easily. Fear had arrived with the first shove in the street. Suspicion had taken its place when the receipt appeared. Then anger had come during the attack, and a brief, reluctant warmth had touched her when Luca gave her tea. She curled her hands around the cup and watched Luca speak quietly to Marco in the hallway. He called her name once when no one else was listening and said only, "Stay where I can see you." Clara answered without a tremor, and Marco shut the door behind him. Outside, the stairwell lamp clicked on and off as the building settled. Elena whispered a final note and slid her pen into the pocket of her coat. Luca turned the key in the bedroom lock once more and left the candle burning low on the table. He closed the apartment's front door with a soft, deliberate motion that sounded like a decision being sealed. The night did not end any truth. It left things arranged differently than before. Clara pressed her forehead briefly to the blanket and then straightened. She would not sleep easily. She would listen for footsteps and for the smallest sound of the stair. When she heard it, she would shout. For now she held the locket, kept the teacup near, and waited for the next movement that would change what she had begun to understand about the place she had been dragged into. A soft knock sounded at the inner door, 3 even taps, and Luca's voice said, "I'll be right outside." "Do not open the door unless I say your name." Clara swallowed and answered, "I understand." The knock became a small, concrete finish to the night's work, and the last thing she heard before she settled into a rigid, watchful rest. Emotion root fear. Emotion shifts. Fear, suspicion, indignation guarded gratitude. Marco slammed the office door and did not wait for the lock to catch. He held a jacket by the shoulder, and the cuff was dark with blood. Lay about her, Marco, dropping the jacket on the desk beside Luca. Suspicion landed in Luca like a stone. He pushed back from the desk and watched the fabric soak into the wood. He wanted names. He wanted the reason. He wanted answers before panic could spread through his men. Luca stood slowly, the motion measured, the way he moved when a choice mattered. "Marco," he said, and the name was the first sharp order in the room. "Who?" "Say the names." Marco leaned forward, chest heaving from the run. "Two men. A courier. Said someone inside wanted the woman identified, and they paid good money for her address." They had a symbol. Marco snapped his fingers and laid out the pattern. A small carved token on the cuff, a sigil Luca recognized, but had not expected to see in his city. The club's back office smelled of spilled whiskey and old lacquer. The neon from the club's sign cut across Luca's jaw in narrow bars. Suspicion tightened Luca's attention into a single axis. Someone feeding their movements. He touched his signet ring without thinking, the metal a familiar weight. Did they see her face? He asked, "Where exactly?" Marco shook his head. "No. Only a clip. Someone watched the bakery and sent a short loop. They would come back if the woman was still where the other side said she would be." Luca's mouth flattened. He remembered the bakery window streaked with rain, a fist of hands on Clara's arm, the strap cutting into her shoulder. He had not meant to take that woman. He had meant to take the wrong woman, and had not corrected the mistake fast enough. Outside the office, the club thrummed with bass and laughter. Inside, orders moved like cold instruments. Sophia stood by the doorway with a phone in one hand and a look that did not soften. Luca sent her for the footage. He sent Marco for the men who had been trailing the courier steps. He ordered 2 cars placed by the side exit and a pair of men to shadow the road to the safe apartment. Each instruction was a small hinge closing toward a cage of protection. At the safe apartment, Clara unfolded a small square of paper in the hallway and read 3 words scrawled in hurried ink. Clara Hayes watched. Her fingers tightened on the paper until the edges bent. Fear, sharp and immediate, rose in her throat and pushed the air out of her. She slid the paper into her pocket and did not tell Luca at once. She stood in the doorway and listened for cars. She smelled the faint oil of Luca's cedar, scented coat on the hallway air, where his men had brushed past earlier. She had not slept. The candle in the living room burned low and left a ring of wax on the table beside her locket. Clara wanted to leave. She wanted distance. She wanted to go to the bakery, to the people who knew her name and the smell of yeast and lemon that anchored her. Instead, she found herself bracing against the corridor wall, while her thumb smoothed the crease in the note. Her hands trembled, so she folded the note again and stuffed it beneath a shoe in the closet, the token of private knowledge hidden under a sensible pair of flats. Back at the club, Luca watched the clip Sophia handed him on a phone. The footage was grainy. Clara bending to pull a tray of croissants, the fluorescent light slicing at the bakery tiles. The camera lingered on her shoulder when the strap was grabbed. Luca's jaw tightened at the exact moment the hand closed. The sound in the phone was a distant hiss. He watched the sleeve of the man who had touched her. The symbol on his cuff came into frame for a heartbeat. Luca's suspicion sharpened into anger. The token matched an emblem his organization used years ago for discreet jobs, a mark he had assumed disappeared with the old guard, who in my line carries that token now. Sophia named 2 men. Marco wrote names on a pad and slid it to Luca. The names were small things on the page, and yet they shifted the map of trust in the club. One name was a captain Luca had trusted. Another name was someone who had taken a step off his radar. Betrayal moved along the paper like a shadow. Luca did not show panic. He set the jacket aside and pulled on a leather coat. "Bring me the roster from last quarter," he said. "Bring me every paid wire, every movement into the outer districts." He paused, then added, "And get Ramos on the line." Quietly, Sophia's jaw tightened. She understood the instruction's danger. Detective Ramos was a polite force who preferred records to raids, and his arrival meant exposure. Marco hesitated. "Luca, you want Ramos here?" Luca's eyes narrowed. "If someone leaks the woman's location, I want a trail that goes back to a badge or a ledger. Call Ramos and tell him to bring credentials, not questions." That sentence held 2 possible meanings. It was an offer of controlled exposure and a warning shot. Clara did not want a detective at her door. She folded plates into a dish towel and kept her back to the hallway when Lucas' man left to answer the knock. She could hear a voice she did not recognize speaking firmly on the other side. Her heart went hard and fast. She pressed a palm to the counter until her fingers whitened. Fear shifted into a different register. Caution. She moved to the little kitchen window and peered at the sky. Dawn had not yet arrived. When Lucas stepped into the apartment doorway, he carried himself like a man who expected his presence to carve safety into a room. He smelled of cedarwood and tobacco. Clara turned and their eyes met. She had seen him in the car under amber light, had watched him as he had leaned into the passenger seat in that rainy night when hands closed on her arm. Now he stood in the doorway wearing a coat that fell heavy over his shoulders. "Clara," he said. The name was simple and had weight. "A man with a badge says he needs to speak with you." "Detective Ramos. He has paperwork." Luca's voice did not plead. It suggested a decision already balanced. Clara's first instinct was to say no. Her second instinct was to ask why a detective would show up unannounced. She found Ramos polite and precise when the man introduced himself in the doorway. "Ms. Hayes, I need to ask you a few questions about a reported abduction." Ramos. He placed a stack of typed pages on the hallway table. His hands were steady. Luca read the documents in one quick sweep and folded them back toward Ramos. "Detective Ramos, Luca, do you have the delivery addresses, the names of the complaining party, and the chain of custody for the clip that was circulated?" Luca's phrasing held the authority of a man who could make a demand sound like a cooperation. Ramos answered carefully. He had the paperwork but not the full chain. He admitted he had been asked to report, not to raid. "We will cooperate under safe counsel." Luca him. He offered a curt nod and a business card folded into his palm. The exchange left Clara more restless than she had been before Ramos arrived. She watched Lucas' hands as he spoke. She watched the way his fingers tightened at a certain name on the paper. She thought of the bakery again, the tray, the strap, the rain on the glass. She Luca quietly, "Do they know where I am?" She his name Luca, with deliberate softness, as if the syllable might buy her a single honest answer. Luca crouched to meet her eye level, the motion controlled. "They have some footage," he said. He did not say who provided it. He did not say whether the watchers saw the address. His silence made a new pressure point. Clara's pulse moved from fear toward an uneasy trust. She watched Luca outline the plan without theatricality. He assigned 2 men to lock the building exits and instructed Sofia to check the intercom records. He Marco to question the club's delivery staff. Each order was a small, precise step that translated suspicion into containment. Tension rose again when Sofia returned with a phone and a clipped clip. The recording showed a shadowed figure slipping a folded note beneath a metal door. The camera angle was cheap and close to the ground. Clara's stomach dropped as she recognized the note in the shot. She had hidden the paper under a shoe. The clip had caught someone slipping a similar note beneath the same door hours earlier. The outside watcher had been closer than the hallway, closer than anyone expected. Luca watched the clip with a face that did not give away what a smaller man might have. He stood and walked away from the screen to the window. He spoke without turning. "Someone inside fed them details," he said. Suspicion slid into accusation. "Someone with access to our list or our routes." He named the possible leak and repeated the names Marco had written earlier. Each repeated name tightened the net around the club's inner circle. Marco swallowed and met Luca's gaze. "Luca, I didn't he put that clip out?" Marco quickly, "I swear." 4 rapid exchanges followed as Luca pressed for specifics and Marco defended his loyalty. The back and forth had the clinch of a small trial, that night braided into early morning with a short, raw encounter at the door. A man approached the apartment and claimed to be a detective with paperwork that suggested a kidnapping complaint. Lucas' reaction had been measured control. Clara's had been suspicion flicked into obedience. The two had not yet argued properly, but their boundary lines appeared. She resisted being told what to do. He insisted on lines drawn for safety. The collision of those two needs created the central fault of the chapter. Dawn had a thin grey when the break-in happened. The intruder moved like a man who knew the lock patterns. He forced the door with a shoulder and a crowbar, and the lock gave under a single strong blow. People in the hallway shouted. Marco and two men were first inside. They moved like trained responders. Luca pushed forward in a leather coat and a low hand on his ring. Clara, for her part, did not wait. She stepped past Marco and confronted the intruder with a kitchen knife in her hand, surprising everyone. The intruder lunged for a table, reckless and raw, and Marco answered with a solid strike. A brief, brutal confrontation followed. A knocked chair, a gun butte of metal against the floor, the intruder's breath loud as he tried to scramble up. Clara kept the knife pointing at him with hands that shook but did not release. "Stay there," she said. Her voice cut through several men who had ready hands. Luca moved behind her, not touching, but his presence tightened the cord around the room. The intruder made one desperate attempt for a pocket. Sofia pinned his arm. Marco cuffed him with practiced fingers. After the man was subdued, Luca ripped the intruder's jacket open to find a small carved token pinned inside, the same symbol Marco had shown him earlier. The token was cheap wood but hand-carved. Luca's expression hardened. "How?" he asked, fingers curling around the piece. "Who gave you this?" The intruder spat and muttered something about payment and a name that matched one on Luca's pad. That name made Marco's face drop. Betrayal unspooled in the foyer like a list of unpaid debts. Luca looked at Marco, at Sofia, at the man under their boots. He looked at Clara. Clara's hand still held the knife. Her knuckles were white. Her chest felt like an animal's that had run too long and then had to stop. Her fear had changed shape again. From suspicion to a fierce, clear decision. She folded the knife and handed it to Marco. She did not cry. She did not faint. She stood and looked straight at Luca. "Who is he?" she asked. The question was simple and demanded clarity. Luca named the arrested man and the larger lead. He spoke in short sentences. He was paid to bring someone to us. He was told to make sure she could be moved. He was told to watch the bakery and the apartment. The token means someone within our circle has sold names. The room tightened. Sofia swore softly. Marco slammed a palm onto the desk and cursed. They found ledger entries on the intruder's phone that tied payments to a handless number. Luca ordered the phone seized and fingers put to the recorders. He Sofia to sift the files for the same token and to cross-check which men had been near Clara's route. Those orders translated betrayal into work. The discovery had shifted the power. Danger was not only outside them now. It lived inside their own net. When the police call finally came, it was Ramos again, more cautious now that a man had been detained. Ramos for a statement. Luca arranged a controlled one and offered his cooperation under strict terms. Ramos agreed to file the report and to keep the location confidential as the investigation continued. Lucas Control purchased a small legal cover and forced the detective into a stream of paperwork that favored containment over spectacle. By dawn, after questions and cuffing the intruder to a chair in the foyer, Luca and Clara sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between them. The candle had burned down to a small pool of wax. The room smelled of coffee and boiled water. Luca set down his hand and did not touch hers. He offered a guarded concession. 1 extra layer of locks, a rotation of men at the door, and a rule that Clara would not go out without informing him for a time. Clara brought up the bakery. "I have work," she said. Her voice was steady. It carried the weight of someone staking a claim. Luca listened. "I know about the bakery," he said. "We will arrange for food deliveries there. We will watch, but you will not move tonight. Do you understand?" They argued in a short, sharp exchange. Clara insisting on independence, Luca insisting on containment. The argument contained 5 rapid turns, where they both named each other's faults, and then stepped back to consider action. The back and forth ended when Clara found herself exhausted, and when Luca offered a practical, small concession he could enforce without losing face. The negotiation shifted their roles, her independence for small safety protocols. They learned in that hour that at least one of Luca's trusted men had been compromised. The token matched a symbol used by a cell that had sold information years ago. That fact redirected Luca's anger toward a root cause he could not yet reach. The intruder had been paid by a handler, and the handler's number traced to a name Marco had not expected. That name belonged to a man who had been on friendly terms with Luca until a year ago. Clara leaned back in her chair and let out a breath she had not known she held. The fear that had hollowed her had not left, but fear softened into something else, temporary steadiness. She looked at Luca and saw not a monster but a man who knew how to make lists and to put boots where he needed them. She also saw he kept his hands on his ring when he felt the pressure of a choice. That small repetition stood out more and more to her as a marker of how he measured emotion. At the doorway, as the morning light grew thinner, Luca placed the carved token on the table between them. He did not slide it toward Clara. He did not touch it again. "We will close this down," he said. "We will find who sold us. For now you stay. For now you let us keep you here. For now I will not let anyone take you again." He spoke the last part quieter, almost to himself. Clara nodded once. She accepted the truce with a guarded kindness. The pact was small and fragile but real. They did not celebrate. The detective took a statement and left with a promise to file and follow up. The arrested man had pockets with city transit cards and a receipt trail. The ledger suggested the handler's payments moved through an old account the club could reach. Luca already had men tracing the small wires. The betrayal had a trail, and Luca would follow it. When Marco closed the apartment door behind the man in cuffs, a folded paper slipped under the door like a second breath. Clara picked it up. The note said, "We are closer than you think." The handwriting was the same as the earlier note, but the ink this time was heavier. Clara slid the paper into her palm and did not show it to Luca at first. Her emotion shifted again, suspicion to alarm to a stoic vigilance. She placed the note on the table beside the token and looked at Luca. He met her eyes and then looked away to the window where the city light thinned into a pale wash. Dawn softened their features and hardened their resolve. The room held the remains of conflict and the small order of a new plan. Luca's concession stood, protection with conditions. Clara's acceptance stood, a fragile truce that kept her life partly intact. The chapter closed on a simple, precise beat. Luca left to follow a ledger lead and told Marco to watch the note they'd found. Clara folded her hands over the paper and the token. She felt the danger as a real object on the table, as concrete as the cup warming her palms. Outside, the city moved indifferent and loud. The immediate danger had been stopped and a betrayal exposed, but the list of questions on Luca's desk had not been erased. Someone inside his circle had sold a name. Someone inside knew how to place a watcher beneath a door. They had not yet found the handler, and the intruder's capture only tightened their sense of how exposed Clara still was. The final image of the chapter is of two small things on a kitchen table, a carved token and a folded note. Luca stepped out the door to a waiting car with a roster in his hand. Clara stayed and watched the street through blinds, the token and the note between her fingers. The choices they had made over the night left them temporarily safer and permanently changed. Emotion root, suspicion emotion shifts. Suspicion, anger, caution, fierce decision, stoic vigilance. The chapter's small conflict resolves. The immediate break in is stopped and the insider mark revealed. The next problems remain. Who handled the sale, which names were compromised, and whether anyone else inside Luca's organization would trade people for money. The morning held a promise of work and a promise of more questions. Luca closed the door and left. Clara folded the note and tucked it into her locket as a new record of what had happened. A blast broke the quiet. A punched roar of metal and fire threw Clara against the kitchen cabinet and sent a rain of glass across the linoleum. Fear landed in her throat and stayed there, sharp and immediate. She tasted copper and the candle wax still burning on the table. Fear was the first force in her body, the feeling that made her hands fumble for the table leg, the thing that pushed her voice out of her mouth. Clara, down. Lucas' command cut through the ringing in her ears, and she obeyed without thinking, curling against the baseboard while a picture on the wall skewed and settled. Clara pulled her knees to her chest and pressed the flat of her palm to her locket until her fingers trembled. Fear drove her movements. It made her check the thread of the silver chain with 2 quick pulls, as if the locket could anchor her to something steady. The apartment smelled of burnt rubber and old oil. Small black flecks drifted like ash across the candle flame. Marco's voice came from the hallway, clipped and busy, windows blown, streets a mess. Where's the woman? Here, Clara, and the word came thin. She looked up and met Lucas' eyes. He stood by the doorway, coat slung over one arm though the night was wet and cold outside. His jaw had hardened into that set she had learned to read. Lucas' hands were steady when he reached for hers, steady enough to pull her to a safer patch of floor, and that steadiness changed the angle of her fear. Fear shifted to a cautious gratefulness that surprised her, and then into a prickling doubt the moment Marco dropped a half-sentence into the doorway. They knew where we were. Marco voiced low, someone put a tracker on the car. Someone knew the exact spot. Marco's fingers went to the collar of a jacket on his shoulder, as if the motion would line up the facts. His words turned the fear in Clara's stomach into a focused, sharp worry about who inside the apartment could have betrayed them. Doubt arrived, cold and precise. Clara's fingers tightened on the locket chain, as if she could feel the outline of the choice ahead. Luca moved through the apartment with quick, efficient orders that cut the air into tasks. Check the stairwell, seal the exits, find the cameras. Enzo snapped to attention and ran down the corridor, boots striking the wood. Luca's voice remained controlled, low. Marco, Enzo now. Check ground level and block the back door. He looked at Clara with a single, quick measure and said, "Stay down." "Keep that on you." He touched the locket lightly, the motion deliberate. Clara felt the weight of his instruction and the weight of the locket at once, and chose to keep it. Her insistence on the locket was a claim to herself. That claim slid the shape of the night's problem into view. She had to keep a piece of her past with her, even if it made locating her easier. They moved through the building with the practiced urgency of people used to danger, but surprised by its immediacy. Lucas' men sealed the stairwell 2 floors below. Clara stayed near the window, breathing through her mouth so the taste of smoke did not choke her. Detective Ruiz arrived at the door within 20 minutes, breathing cold air and wearing a coat damp at the collar. I followed the blast. Ruiz. He held a small notepad and watched the apartment with a lawman's caution. Anyone injured. His eyes flicked to Enzo's shoulder, to Marco's hands. Clara stood and spoke before Luca could. She moved toward the foyer entrance with the slow, steady gait she learned to match to other people's tempo when frightened. "If I leave with the police, do I go to safety?" she asked. The question was simple and practical. It was the kind of question she had asked at the bakery when supplies went missing, the kind she now asked to measure her options. Fear pushed the question out, but below it was a different pulse agency. She wanted to know what she could control. Detective Ruiz did not answer immediately. He stepped into the doorway and looked at Luca, who had the gold signet ring on one hand and a coat creased at the elbow. "Detective Ruiz, Luca. You don't know what you're asking to take in here. You don't know who you'll be carrying out." Luca's voice held a warning beneath its calm. His words shifted Clara's uncertainty into a sharper anxiety. She watched him and felt the room narrow to the 3 of them. The detective with his notepad, Luca with his quiet menace, and herself surrendering to a decision. Ruiz set his jaw, then said, "You have to let me check. Protocol. Reports say an explosive device was used on the car. If there's a threat inside, those people on the street need help." His eyes rested a fraction too long on the locket, then moved away. Clara saw it. Her suspicion hardened for a beat, short, quick, and she held her chain like a small anchor. The detective's presence introduced another motion in the night's calculus. The possibility that law could take her, and with it a different kind of danger. Marco's hand tapped his phone. We were hit from a distance. The tracker was an aftermarket unit with a cheap SIM. Whoever did this didn't come close themselves. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at Luca. Someone must have told them the address. Inside, Clara's mouth went dry. A betrayal inside Luca's circle turned her fear into a new, sharper grief, mistrust. Mistrust sat at the base of her choices. She had to decide whether to trust Luca when everyone else might be compromised. The chain around her neck warmed against her skin when she breathed in. Her second decision that night took the shape of a soft but firm sentence. "I want to leave until I know this place is secure," she said. The words landed as a small, steady act of defiance against being moved like a piece on someone else's board. Enzo returned 2 minutes later with a report that tightened the room like a wire. 2 men at the alley were arrested by patrols, but they were just delivery boys. They didn't know who hired them. Cameras on 3rd block were cut at 3 a.m. He spit the time out like a fact that hurt. Someone planned this and covered tracks. Enzo's hands were steady, but the bruise on his knuckles showed he had pushed himself to get the news quickly. Luca listened, then said, "Gianni's men have been noisy. They do want us out of that apartment tonight." He took a step forward, as if to flatten a rumor into something with weight. "But if it's an inside job, I need names. Marco, pull recent access logs. Enzo, check our men." Now the order forced movement, and movement broke the spiral of Clara's suspicion into tasks they could perform together. Her fear shifted again, this time toward determination. Determination focused her fingers on the locket so tightly she could feel the clasp's edge. The stairwell breach came 5 minutes later. Feet pounded 3 at a time and a shouted number barked through the corridor. Shots fired, sharp, close, and someone crashed into the apartment door like a battering ram. Luca moved as if the violence were familiar muscle memory. He placed himself between Clara and the entrance with a speed that had only one purpose. "Get back!" he shouted. Marco and Enzo flanked the door. Clara heard the padlock splinter. The world narrowed to wood and the smell of gunpowder. A man in a dark jacket shoved inside, and the hallway became a choke of bodies and angles. Luca's hand found the attacker and turned him with a motion so clean Clara's breath caught. She had watched Luca handle men before, and always with a distance. Tonight, the men he moved through were shorter steps on his path to protect her. Enzo screamed once and dropped to his knees, hand pressed over a wound at his side. Blood darkened his palm and his face closed into a hard line. "Enzo." Luca, the name snapped out like a rope. Enzo's fall shifted everything. Marco cursed and ran forward with a blanket ripped from a chair to clamp over the wound. Gianni's men. Marco, teeth clenched, they came faster than expected. "Someone gave them our floor." The accusation in his voice wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, but Clara felt its weight land on them all. Marco's fingers trembled as he pressed fabric to Enzo's ribs. The sight of Luca kneeling by Enzo's side, face blunt with worry, pulled at something in Clara she hadn't named. Her fear moved into a soft pity that she didn't want to feel, pity that made her sorry for being a cause of more hurt. Luca's face did not soften. He stripped his coat and bound Enzo's side with a strip of cloth, working with hands that had folded money and steadied threats, not performed first aid. "Help me move him to the bedroom," Luca ordered. Marco checked the stairwell again and cut power to the corridor cameras. "Ruiz, get me a description of who you picked up outside." Luca's list of commands was a map. It forced the others into action and kept Clara from falling into helplessness. Detective Ruiz hesitated. We detained 2 nearby, but they were low level. They want to be the link. He lowered his voice and said, "Someone in your circle must have felt threatened enough to trade location for safety." Ruiz avoided saying a name. His eyes searched Marco's face and lingered on Luca's signet ring. The implication was blunt. It left a fresh hollow of suspicion that pushed into the space between them. When Marco returned from the stairwell with a phone and a white expression, he placed the device on the coffee table as if it weighed more than it did. "I found this in the alley, behind a trash pile where the attackers ditched it. It's a burner with a clone of Enzo's last call list on it. Someone duplicated Enzo's contacts and used them to route orders." He tapped the screen. "They made it look like one of ours called the hit team." Marco's voice broke at the end of the sentence, and he looked down at his hands. The accusation now hung with the room's suit and the scent of hospital alcohol. Clara sat forward. She, who would do that? The question sounded small, almost foolish, and then it was filled by Marco's next words. "Gianni's techs are ruthless. They can clone numbers now. This doesn't prove betrayal by names inside, but it proves someone wanted us to think there was a leak." Marco's face was a map of disbelief. He Luca's name aloud, as if speaking it would steady the fact. "Luca, you should know." Luca's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes on Marco and said, "Gianni wants you scared. I want to hand people over to him." The sentence was simple and direct. It announced a decision out loud. It made Clara's stomach drop and then settle into a clarity she had not expected. Luca would choose to protect her, publicly, against a rival, and that choice would make consequences real. They cleared the apartment and prepared the small study as a temporary triage. Enzo's breathing was shallow but steady. Marco kept talking quietly to him as if the words could stitch him together. Outside someone shouted. Distant sirens came and went like a loose rhythm. Detective Ruiz returned with a thin packet of information he had pulled from the street teams. 2 cars registered to a shell company owned by Gianni's front. Their plates were swapped. Whoever did this expected us to turn and run. They wanted to make a spectacle in front of witnesses. Ruiz tapped the copy of a license plate on the paper and then folded it back into his coat. "If you plan to stay, you will need to expect follow-ups. We can protect you for now, but official relocation takes time. You understand?" That his voice softened only a fraction. Clara looked at Enzo, then at Luca, then at Marco. The choices arranged themselves in a clear line. Stay with a Mafia boss who'd taken her by mistake and now refused to give her up, or leave with the police and become another file in a system that might not keep promises when Gianni decided to push. She thought of the bakery window, of the way rain had stuck to her hair the night she'd been dragged from the street, and of the way Marco had slammed a jacket onto Luca's desk when he first came with the news. Those memories were concrete anchors, not metaphors. Marco's jacket, the rain on the glass, the smell of candle wax. They formed a material argument for staying. Clara, Luca quietly. He had sutured the steadiness in his voice into something that was not just an order. "If Gianni wants a public show, I'll give him one. But not her. Not you." He looked at her with an intensity that was not theatrical. "If you stay with rules. You stay with boundaries. I will not let anyone take you from me." The words were both a promise and a claim. Clara felt the shape of them like a weight on the table between them. The rooftop confrontation came before dawn. Luca led them up a flight of back stairs, now guarded and sealed, to the roof hatch, where the city opened in a horizon of sodium lights and steam. The air up there smelled of wet concrete and a diesel tang from a nearby truck. Gianni's men waited on the lower roof, forms dark against the orange glow. Gianni himself stepped forward, hands empty and smile thin. "Hand her over, Luca," he said. "You make this harder than it needs to be." His voice had a practiced ease. Luca answered without flinching, "No. I will not hand her over. His choice was a public refusal that had weight. He pushed forward when Gianni stepped closer and the two men measured each other in the city light. Guns lowered and then rose. The rooftop became a chessboard with the city below as the audience. Marco and Enzo stood behind Luca, breaths visible in the cold. Clara's heart beat like a small drum in her throat. The fear in her tightened into a grim calm that made her hands go numb. Gianni's men surged. The fight broke into motion, metal clashed, boots slid on grit, a shout, a learned motion to throw someone off balance. Enzo moved like a man who had already given up pain for a cause. He took the first round of blows to pull an assassin off Luca. A bullet grazed Enzo's shoulder. He dropped to the ground and spat out a curse. Marco lunged forward and struck a man behind Gianni, trading a blow that sent the assailant stumbling toward the low roof wall. Luca found Gianni in the middle of the clash. He grabbed his collar and pushed him to the edge, face inches from the others. You took a piece of my night and paid for it. Luca. His voice was low and final. This ends now. Walk away and you live. Stick your head out and you'll lose more than men. The threat carried the net weight of someone who had measured his losses before. Gianni's smile flickered and then went. He looked at his men, then at Luca, and something like calculation crossed his features. He nodded once and turned away. The retreat was fast and furious. Gianni's men withdrew with an exaggerated show of dignity, as if the bargaining had been part of choreography. They melted into the city, leaving the roof littered with cigarette butts and a scattering of gravel. Detective Ruiz and his team arrived moments later, breathless and official. He took statements, his pen scoring lines across paper. We'll process the men we can get. Ruiz, we saw them pull back. There's a trail. We'll follow it. His tone contained a new, cautious respect. Back in the apartment at dawn, the air felt like a place where decisions had been executed and could not be undone. Enzo sat propped up on the couch, a bandage tight around his ribs. Marco fussed at his side and kept asking if he wanted anything to drink. Luca moved to the small kitchen and set 2 mugs on the table, steam curling like a small apology. He poured and slid one to Clara without looking at her directly. Coffee, he said. The word was ordinary and oddly intimate. Clara took the mug with fingers that still shook. She set the locket on the table between them and tapped it once with the pad of her thumb. The gesture was quiet and deliberate. You chose to come out for me, she said. She did not use the word love. She used the fact of the action, and that sufficed. You didn't have to. Luca's mouth tightened, but he did not look away. I didn't he have to, no. But I did. He raised his own mug in a small, unceremonious toast for Enzo, for Marco. For making sure the room didn't fall apart tonight. His eyes flicked to the bandage, and for you, the simplicity of his list removed the need for a grand speech. Marco, who had been silent for a long time, blew air out of his nose and said, We found a cloned signal. Gianni's techs are better than we thought, but they used a known shell company. There's money trails I can follow. I can tie some purchases to one of Gianni's lieutenants. We'll hit his supply lines. We'll make it expensive. Marco's voice carried the old anger and competence that had first pushed him into Luca's service. He named details, accounts, shell addresses, a laundromat that served as a drop. The specificity of his plan gave Clara something practical to hold onto. Detective Ruiz nodded. We can run some warrants. There's enough for an inquiry now. We can seize the shell accounts and process the men who tried to make this a spectacle. It won't end Gianni, but it will cut off funds. It will give you some breathing room. Ruiz's words were plain and concrete. Clara accepted them as material help rather than promises of safety. She balanced the fact of police procedure against the reality of Luca's protection and decided, quietly, that she would stay for now. At breakfast, the conversation turned small and practical. Luca Marco about lead times and when they could strike supply catches. Marco talked through times and places, and his voice grew steadier. Enzo made a joke about Luca finally admitting he knew how to make a coffee that wasn't terrible. A small laugh slipped out of Clara before she could stop it. The sound was bright and felt almost reckless. It loosened something in the room. They worked through the morning with lists and calls. Marco and Detective Ruiz shared a sheet of paper. Marco circled a laundromat on the edge of town that had routinely taken cash deliveries late at night. "We hit there first, Marco. If I can freeze the accounts tied to it, Gianni will feel the squeeze where he keeps his men fed." Marco's plan was detailed and specific, not rhetorical. The strategy turned the night's fear into a schedule of work. Enzo's wound required a staple, and the medic on call in Luca's network came to the apartment to close the skin. He worked with quick, practiced hands while Luca stood and watched. Clara noticed how Luca's hands moved when he wasn't giving orders, more tentative, less certain of the space between men and need. She realized she had been watching his hands since the night of the mistake. The way he smoothed a creased sleeve, the way he touched his ring when he decided something. Those small gestures accumulated into a language she was learning to read. By midday, Detective Ruiz had made a show of taking statements and leaving with a promise to follow financial leads. He paused before he left and spoke to Luca directly. "You did the right thing on the roof," he said. "You didn't hand her over. That will make our job harder and yours riskier, but it also narrows some options for Gianni. He can't easily claim you were hiding a witness if you refused a public exchange." Ruiz's tone balanced official caution with the hint of a truce. The detective's words were pragmatic. They changed the battleground from the roof to ledgers and phone records. Clara put the locket back on. She clasped it with a hand that had learned to move in crises with small, functional steadiness. The locket clicked. The sound was a clear, physical beat in the room. She met Luca's eyes and said, "I'll stay, for now. But I want to be kept like cargo." The sentence was precise. It refused passive status without challenging the protection she now accepted. It was the kind of concrete boundary she needed. Luca nodded. "I want to keep you like cargo," he said. "You want to be an exhibit. You will have a say. You will leave when you choose to leave. That's my promise." He didn't add declarations of change or grand vows. He spoke in terms of actions, of decisions, of facts. The lack of poetry felt honest. Clara felt the shape of it fitting against the choices she still needed to make. Marco left that afternoon to begin the supply line pressure. He kissed Enzo's forehead lightly, and when he put his hand on Luca's shoulder before he left, his look said more than words. Marco was loyal, pragmatic, and he had a way of making anger into plans. Detective Ruiz sent a file across official channels and promised to pursue warrants on shell accounts. Enzo remained bandaged and grumpy, making jokes about being spoiled by both sides. When the apartment quieted in the late day, Luca took a chair across from Clara and removed his gloves slowly. He reached for a pen and wrote a short list of boundaries on a scrap of paper. Visits by named men only, routes changed daily, 2 safe houses if needed. He slid the paper across the table. The list was small and practical. Its very physicality made the protection feel like something they could measure and change when necessary. Clara read the lines and felt her stomach unclench a fraction. There was still the matter of who had tried to frame them. Marco found a ledger in Gianni's laundromat the next day and traced transactions to a courier company that had recently changed corporate hands. The trace led to a middle manager who had recently bribed a tech to clone numbers. It was not a simple name inside Luca's inner circle. It was a chain that ran outward. The twist, Gianni had staged an inside job appearance, unfolded in Marco's hands like a file. The revelation changed the way the betrayal felt. It was not a personal treachery by the few men Clara had met, but a strategic, ugly deception from someone who wanted to force a spectacle. The discovery was specific, technical, and left little room for romanticized betrayal. In the end, Gianni lost more than he expected. The raid squeezed his cash flow. Several of his lieutenants vanished into custody or into safe hiding. Enzo's wound healed with the slow, practical care Marco insisted on. Detective Ruiz secured several warrants and presented evidence in court that would make Gianni's men spend time under supervision. Luca did not celebrate publicly. He ordered a quiet, efficient series of moves that cut Gianni off where it hurt. The result was a shift in territory that left Luca's neighborhood bruised but intact. Clara watched the practical aftermath unfold and felt a new current of something that was not purely gratitude. It was a careful testing trust that grew from repeated choices made by others. Marco's determination, Enzo's sacrifice, Luca's refusal to hand her over. She did not pretend the danger had vanished, but the immediate threat had been addressed with tangible actions. That solidity changed the texture of her nights. They no longer felt like traps so much as negotiated spaces. On the morning after the rooftop, Luca walked Clara to the window and placed his hand on the sill. They watched a delivery truck pass, ordinary and mundane. "Luca, you're safe here for as long as you need a roof. But you'll keep living. Go out with Marco when he runs errands. Learn the neighborhood roads. Keep the locket. Keep your job when you can." His list was a set of permissions. It allowed her small freedoms within the protection he provided. Clara slid the locket under her shirt and nodded. "I will keep living," she said. The sentence was not dramatic. It was a promise of incremental actions. She would return to the bakery when the nights felt quiet enough, or find a new place to work if that felt safer. She had been dragged into another life by mistake. She would not let the mistake define the only choices available to her. That day, as they sat with the remains of breakfast and the quiet of a room where decisions had been executed, Luca reached out and picked up Clara's hand. He did not speak a line of sweeping emotion. He tightened his fingers in a small, steady pressure. The action was concrete and simple. Clara felt it as an agreement between two people who had crossed a dangerous seam and chosen to make small, repeated decisions that defined them. The chapter closed on a specific picture. The two cups cooling on the table, Marco's bag at the door, Enzo asleep with a bandage on his side, Detective Ruiz's file on the coffee table, and the locket warm under Clara's blouse. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside, a set of choices had been made and a bargain struck. Clara placed her other hand over Luca's and said, quietly, "I will stay for now." Luca nodded once and let go, and the sound of the locket clicking closed the night's sequence of actions. The ending was a concrete decision, set in daylight and tied to real names and real wounds, not to vague promises. It was the kind of ending that changed the rules of their lives and left their walls already beginning to show the first small cracks.